January 1945, a B-17 Flying Fortress limps back to England with two engines dead, hydraulics destroyed, and the landing gear jammed in the up position. The pilot has no choice, belly landing on the runway is the only option. But there's a problem nobody can solve. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Michael Chen is trapped in the turret. The hydraulics that rotate the turret are destroyed. The manual hand crank system is jammed from flak damage. The turret is stuck in the down position, guns pointing at the ground. Chen is hanging upside down inside that sphere, and he cannot get out. The pilot does the math. When the bomber touches down on its belly, the ball turret will be the first thing to hit the runway. The turret will be ground between 30 tons of aircraft and the concrete runway at 90 miles per hour. The sphere is strong, but not that strong. The turret will be crushed. Chen will be crushed inside it. The crew can hear him on the intercom. He knows exactly what's about to happen. And there's nothing anyone can do to save him. The aircraft landed. Chen survived. Not injured, survived. The ball turret that should have been crushed flat absorbed the impact in a way that nobody, including the engineers who designed it, thought was possible. This is how one trapped gunner lived through a landing that should have killed him instantly. To understand why Chen should be dead, you need to understand the physics of a belly landing. A B-17 at landing weight, around 60,000 pounds with minimal fuel and ammunition remaining, touches down at roughly 90 miles per hour. In a normal landing with gear extended, the landing gear absorbs the impact through shock struts designed to compress and dissipate energy gradually. The aircraft settles onto the runway at a controlled rate. In a belly landing, there are no shock absorbers. The fuselage hits the runway and all that kinetic energy transfers instantly into the structure. The metal skin of the belly scrapes across concrete. If the belly is smooth, the aircraft might slide relatively gently, friction gradually slowing it down. But the ball turret isn't smooth. It's a sphere protruding 3 feet below the fuselage. When a B-17 with a ball turret belly lands, the turret hits first and takes the full impact of 30 tons of aircraft traveling at 90 miles per hour. The Sperry ball turret was engineered to withstand several types of forces. Aerodynamic pressure at high speed and altitude. Recoil forces from firing twin .50 caliber machine guns. The structural loads of the turret's own weight plus the gunner's weight hanging in a sphere attached to the aircraft. But it was never designed to be a landing gear. The specification said nothing about absorbing a belly landing impact because the design assumption was that the turret would be rotated to the stowed position, guns facing aft and up, before landing. Pulling the turret partially into the fuselage and out of the way, Chen's turret was stuck in the worst possible position, guns pointing straight down, turret fully extended. The lowest point of the entire aircraft. When that aircraft touched down, the ball turret would hit the runway first, and the impact forces would be catastrophic. Boeing engineers later calculated the expected impact force at approximately 400,000 pounds, 200 tons, concentrated on the sphere's contact point with the runway. The turret was designed to handle maybe 10% of that force. The crew knew what would happen. The pilot had radioed ahead to the tower. Emergency crews were standing by. The aircraft had enough fuel for maybe 20 more minutes of flight. The pilot had considered ordering Chen to bail out over the English Channel. At least he'd have a chance with a parachute and rescue boats. But Chen refused. Bailing out over cold water in January meant hypothermia and probably death before rescue arrived. He'd rather take his chances with the landing. The pilot respected that decision. Chen would stay in the turret. They would land. Whatever happened next, happened. The rest of the crew braced for the landing. The pilot lined up on the runway, kept the nose high as long as possible to avoid hitting with the forward fuselage first. The B-17 descended in a slight nose-up attitude. The ball turret, with Chen trapped inside, would touch first, followed milliseconds later by the aft fuselage belly, then the nose. The pilot cut power. The aircraft dropped the last few feet. Impact, the sound was catastrophic. Metal screaming on concrete. Sparks visible even in daylight. The Ball turret hit the runway at 90 miles per hour and the aircraft's full weight came down on it instantly. From outside, observers saw the turret collapse inward, the bottom of the sphere crushed flat where it contacted the runway. The aircraft slid for nearly 1,000 feet, the turret grinding along the concrete, leaving a trail of metal fragments and sparks. Inside the turret, Chen experienced something that seemed impossible. The impact was violent, a sudden crushing sensation as the turret deformed. But the deformation wasn't uniform. The bottom of the turret, where it contacted the runway, crushed inward and upward. But the crushing wasn't instantaneous. The metal deformed progressively, absorbing energy through the deformation itself. The turret essentially crumpled in a way that spread the impact over several seconds instead of a single instant. More critically, the turret's spherical shape meant it didn't stop moving when it hit. A flat surface hitting a runway would dig in and stop violently. A sphere hitting at an angle rolls. The Ball turret hit and immediately began rotating backward as the aircraft's forward momentum forced it to roll along the runway. This rotation dissipated energy. Instead of a static impact absorbing all the force in one location, the force was distributed around the rotating sphere. Chen's position inside the turret was critical to his survival. He was hanging in the gunner's harness, facing forward and down. His body was not in contact with the lowest point of the sphere, the part that hit the runway first. There was approximately 8 to 10 inches of clearance between his body and the turret's lowest point when properly positioned in the harness. When the turret crushed inward, that space was consumed, but the crushing stopped before reaching his body. The impact forces tried to throw Chen forward and down into the crushing lower section of the turret. But the gunner's harness held him. The harness was designed to restrain the gunner during violent aircraft maneuvers and the recoil forces of firing heavy machine guns. It was over-engineered for normal operations, which meant it had safety margins beyond what was typically needed. Those margins saved Chen's life. The harness stretched under the impact load. It wasn't designed to stretch, but all materials stretch under sufficient force, and that stretch absorbed some of the energy that would otherwise have been transmitted directly to Chen's body. The turret crushed inward approximately 6 inches at the impact point. The guns, which had been pointing straight down, bent upward as their mounts were forced backward by the runway contact. The turret's plexiglass panels shattered completely, fragments of plexiglass flew in all directions inside the turret. Chen's flight suit and gear protected him from the worst of the glass. The oxygen bottle mounted inside the turret broke free from its mounting and struck Chen's leg, fracturing his fibula. But he remained conscious throughout the entire impact and slide. When the aircraft finally stopped sliding, emergency crews rushed to the Ball turret expecting to extract a body. Instead, they found Chen conscious and talking. He was hanging in the harness, surrounded by shattered plexiglass and crumpled metal, with blood running down his leg from the broken bone, but alive and alert. The crews couldn't believe it. They'd seen belly landings with trapped gunners before. None of those gunners had survived. The turrets had been crushed flat. This time, somehow, the turret had crumpled just enough to absorb the impact but not enough to reach the gunner inside. After Chen was extracted and sent to the hospital, he'd spend 6 weeks recovering from the broken leg and various bruises and contusions. Army Air Force engineers descended on the wrecked B-17 to understand what had happened. They needed to know if this was luck or if there was some engineering principle they'd missed that could save other trapped gunners. The investigation revealed several factors that aligned to create survival where none should exist. First, the turret's construction method. The Sperry Ball turret was built with a framework of curved ribs, structural members that defined the sphere's shape, covered with panels of steel and plexiglass. The ribs were the primary structure. The panels were secondary, providing the pressure-resistant skin. When the turret hit the runway, the panels and some ribs deformed, but the primary structural ribs held their integrity. The turret crushed but didn't collapse entirely because those main ribs remained largely intact. Second, the ammunition boxes. The Ball turret carried 2 ammunition boxes for the twin .50 caliber guns, positioned on either side of the gunner. These boxes were made of heavy steel and were designed to contain a catastrophic cook-off if ammunition ignited from fire or damage. They were essentially small armored boxes. When the turret crushed, these ammunition boxes acted as internal bracing. They couldn't be crushed easily, so they helped maintain a survival space around the gunner even as the outer turret structure deformed inward. Third, the harness design. Boeing and Sperry had designed the gunner's harness to be adjustable for gunners of different sizes. This meant there was built-in slack in the harness system. When properly adjusted for a specific gunner, the slack was taken up, but it was still there in the material and the adjustment mechanisms. Under extreme load, this slack allowed the harness to stretch and elongate, absorbing energy through material deformation rather than transmitting all the force directly to the gunner's body. Fourth, the impact angle. The B-17 had touched down in a slight nose-up attitude, meaning the ball turret hit the runway at an angle rather than straight down. This angle was only 5 to 8 degrees. But it was enough to initiate the rotation of the turret rather than a pure vertical crushing impact. If the aircraft had landed perfectly level or nose down, the impact would have been more directly vertical and likely wouldn't have survived. Fifth, and most remarkably, the runway surface condition. The runway was concrete, not asphalt. Concrete is harder but also more brittle than asphalt. When the steel turret hit the concrete at high speed, it didn't just deform the turret, it also damaged the concrete. The investigation found a gouge in the runway nearly 2 inches deep where the turret had first impacted. That gouge represented concrete being crushed and displaced. The energy required to crush that concrete came from the impact, which meant slightly less energy was available to crush the turret. It was a small difference, maybe 5% of the total energy, but at the margins of survival, 5% can be the difference between life and death. The engineers concluded that Chen's survival was a combination of good engineering, fortunate circumstances, and the specific sequence of events during the impact. It wasn't reproducible. Another belly landing with a trapped gunner wouldn't necessarily have the same outcome. Third, the harness design. Boeing and Sperry had designed the gunner's harness to be adjustable for gunners of different sizes. This meant there was built-in slack in the harness system. When properly adjusted for a specific gunner, the slack was taken up, but it was still there in the material and the adjustment mechanisms. Under extreme load, this slack allowed the harness to stretch and elongate, absorbing energy through material deformation rather than transmitting all the force directly to the gunner's body. Fourth, the impact angle. The B-17 had touched down in a slight nose-up attitude, meaning the ball turret hit the runway at an angle rather than straight down. This angle was only 5 to 8 degrees. But it was enough to initiate the rotation of the turret rather than a pure vertical crushing impact. If the aircraft had landed perfectly level or nose down, the impact would have been more directly vertical and likely wouldn't have survived. Fifth, and most remarkably, the runway surface condition. The runway was concrete, not asphalt. Concrete is harder but also more brittle than asphalt. When the steel turret hit the concrete at high speed, it didn't just deform the turret, it also damaged the concrete. The investigation found a gouge in the runway nearly 2 inches deep where the turret had first impacted. That gouge represented concrete being crushed and displaced. The energy required to crush that concrete came from the impact, which meant slightly less energy was available to crush the turret. It was a small difference, maybe 5% of the total energy, but at the margins of survival, 5% can be the difference between life and death. The engineers concluded that Chen's survival was a combination of good engineering, fortunate circumstances, and the specific sequence of events during the impact. It wasn't reproducible. Another belly landing with a trapped gunner wouldn't necessarily have the same outcome. Chen's survival became somewhat famous within the 8th Air Force. Word spread quickly, trapped gunner survives belly landing. Other crews wanted to know the details. How did he brace? What position was the turret in? Was there something they could do to increase survival odds if they found themselves in the same situation? The Air Force couldn't give them a procedure because there wasn't one. Chen had simply hung in the harness in standard position and hoped. The factors that saved him, the angle of impact, the ammunition boxes, the harness stretch, weren't things a gunner could control or optimize. But they did make changes based on what they learned. First, they modified emergency procedures for aircraft with damaged hydraulics. New protocol required pilots to attempt belly landings with gear up and turret stuck in the down position to delay as long as possible, using every available minute to troubleshoot the turret rotation problem. If rotation couldn't be achieved, the new procedure was to have the trapped gunner brace in a specific position, facing forward, hands on the gun controls to brace upper body, legs pulled up as high as possible to maximize distance from the impact point, and the pilot would land in the shallowest possible nose-up attitude to maximize the impact angle. Second, they expedited the rollout of improved hydraulic line routing on new B-17G models. Many turret jams were caused by flak or fighter fire damaging hydraulic lines. Rerouting those lines through more protected areas of the fuselage reduced the probability of hydraulic failure, which reduced the probability of turrets getting stuck in dangerous positions. Third, and most significantly for Chen, they established a fund for injured airmen. Chen's broken leg and recovery time meant he couldn't fly combat missions anymore. In early 1945, injured airmen who couldn't return to combat were often simply sent home with medical discharge and whatever military disability pay they qualified for. After Chen's case gained attention, there was a push to ensure that airmen injured saving the lives of their crewmates, which Chen effectively did by agreeing to stay in the turret rather than forcing the aircraft to attempt a dangerous bailout over water, received full recognition and support. Chen's survival wasn't a miracle. It was physics, engineering, and specific circumstances aligning in a way that created a survival space where none should exist. The ball turret crushed, but it crushed progressively rather than catastrophically. The harness held, but it stretched enough to absorb shock. The ammunition boxes braced, providing internal structure. The impact angle initiated rotation rather than static crushing. Every one of these factors was necessary. Remove any single one, and Chen dies. The broader lesson is about engineering margins and failure modes. The ball turret wasn't designed to survive a belly landing. But the engineers who designed it had built-in safety margins for the forces they did anticipate: flight loads, gun recoil, pressure differentials. Those safety margins, combined with the inherent strength of the spherical design, created just enough robustness to survive a failure mode that was never in the design specification. This is what good engineering does. It doesn't just meet the minimum requirements. It exceeds them with margins that might seem wasteful under normal conditions but become critical in abnormal conditions. The ball turret's designers never imagined their turret would be used as landing gear. But they designed it strong enough that when it was forced into that role, it performed barely well enough to save a life. Chen returned to the United States in March 1945. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for shooting down enemy aircraft, but for the 23 combat missions he'd flown before the belly landing, and for the courage of staying in the turret when bailing out was an option. April 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The spring air carried a brittle chill, lingering over a countryside scarred by months of relentless bombing, scorched earth, and the desolation of retreating armies. Sergeant James Harper's unit had been advancing cautiously through fields littered with remnants of war, abandoned tractors, shattered fences, and homes reduced to splintered husks. Every hill, every grove, and every hollow in the land held the potential for danger, but it also held the possibility of discovery, and in this fragile tension between fear and hope, the unit spotted something remarkable: a massive barn, standing defiantly atop an abandoned farm. Smoke rose lazily from makeshift chimneys. Curling in thin, twisting columns toward the clouded sky, could be enemy holdouts, Private Rodriguez muttered, adjusting his grip on his rifle, eyes scanning the edges of the property with a mixture of suspicion and unease. The barn, its weathered timbers stretching toward the sky, seemed both ancient and imposing. Its stone foundation had survived countless storms and battles, its beams groaning under the weight of decades. It was the kind of structure that might have once been a home, a place of life and work, now scarred by neglect and the chaos of war, Germans hiding, or civilians, James said carefully, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. Yet that knowledge brought no comfort. Desperation, as he had learned over countless engagements, could make soldiers unpredictable, and civilians could harbor fear so intense it drove them to dangerous extremes. As the unit advanced cautiously, weapons ready, every sense was alert. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth, the ground underfoot uneven, soft in places from recent rains. Each step brought a creak from the old barn doors, a shiver through the frame, a reminder that the building itself was fragile, yet sturdy enough to hold whatever, or whoever, lay within. Then came a sound that froze James in place, silencing even the rustle of his men's movements. Children crying. The plaintive, terrified wail echoed faintly from inside the barn, slicing through the tension with a sudden, human clarity. "Hold fire!" he ordered sharply, his voice cutting through the whispers and soft murmurs of the unit. The soldiers froze, rifles steady, adrenaline sharpening their reflexes even as confusion clouded their minds. Rodriguez's brow furrowed. "Those are kids. Could be a trap, though," he whispered. His voice held the edge of fear and disbelief. James's jaw tightened. He had seen booby traps, ambushes, and desperation used as weapons of war, but this was different. The sound of children crying could not be ignored. The weight of choice pressed down on him. Step forward, investigate, risk potential exposure, or step back, leave them, and live with the consequences of inaction. James moved to the barn's massive door, hand steady on the latch despite his racing heartbeat. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. The interior was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The barn was packed, hundreds of small, trembling bodies huddled together for warmth. Toddlers clutched ragged blankets, older children embraced the younger ones, some curled in silence, others rocking gently or murmuring softly to themselves. Filth and grime coated their clothing and skin. Evidence of long weeks without adequate food, water, or hygiene. Corporal Miller's whisper cut through the quiet gloom. "Dear God! What is this?" An older girl, perhaps 15, stepped forward from the cluster, her face pale, eyes wide with fear and hope mingled. She spoke rapidly in German, voice quivering as if the words themselves were a lifeline to some fragile hope. James motioned to Private Clean, the unit's translator. He knelt, listening intently. After a moment, he straightened, voice shaking as he relayed the girl's message. "They're orphans," Clean said, almost unable to believe it himself. "From all over Germany. Parents killed in bombings, fighting camps. They were in an orphanage in Munich. When the city was bombed, the staff fled. These children walked 40 miles. Looking for shelter." James's heart sank. "How long have they been here?" he asked. Clean translated quickly, voice catching. 2 weeks. No food left. 3 children died yesterday from cold and hunger." The enormity of the revelation pressed on him with staggering weight. German children, technically enemy civilians, dying in a barn while armed American soldiers stood outside, fully capable of offering aid. What were they supposed to do? The choice was clear in its moral gravity, yet fraught with potential consequences. This was no longer a military engagement, it was a test of humanity itself. Sergeant Miller's voice broke through the tension. "What do we do?" James looked around at the huddled children, their hollow eyes reflecting both fear and hope. Their nationality, once a matter of military concern, now seemed irrelevant. They were children, human beings, innocent in a world that had demanded so much from them far too soon. "We help them," he said, voice firm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. Miller hesitated. "Sir. Regulations." James's expression hardened. "I don't care about regulations. These are children. We're soldiers, not monsters. Command might have our heads for this." Then they'll have mine. But I'm not leaving kids to die because bureaucrats wrote rules that don't account for basic human decency. He turned to his unit, issuing orders with the precision of a man accustomed to life and death decisions. Rodriguez, Miller, scout the farm for supplies. Clean, talk to that girl, find out what they need most urgently. Daniels, radio command. Tell them we found civilians requiring humanitarian assistance. Don't sugarcoat it. Let them know they're children. Let command deal with the politics. The unit moved into action. Years of rigorous military training now redirected toward saving lives instead of taking them. Rodriguez and Miller explored the property and found a root cellar with preserved vegetables, a well with clean water, firewood stacked neatly in a shed. The nearby farmhouse, abandoned but structurally sound, could shelter the younger children, providing protection from wind and weather far better than the barn could offer. James took a moment to survey the scene, noting the transformation of his men. Battle-hardened soldiers, accustomed to strategy and firepower, were now caregivers, planners, providers. This isn't what war was supposed to look like, James thought. Staring at the huddled children. But maybe this is what ending war looks like. He ordered the first priority: feed them. Small portions, warm water, carefully rationed. Their stomachs had been empty too long, any sudden intake could be dangerous. Medical needs would follow, triaged according to urgency. Anna, the older girl, stepped forward again, speaking slowly in carefully learned English. Why? Why help us? Her eyes, large and wary, searched James's face. Your children, he said simply. That's all that matters. Your commanders might be angry, but right now, you need food, warmth, and safety. That's what you're getting. Tears ran down Anna's face as she whispered. Thank you. We thought we would die here. The soldiers set to work. Water was heated, food carefully distributed. Slowly, the fear in the children's faces began to give way to cautious hope. Some smiled, some cried, some simply stared, trying to process the sudden intrusion of safety and kindness into a life defined by loss. Clean whispered to James, voice low. Command won't like this. Higher-ups, regulations. This isn't what we were sent to do. James shook his head, resolute. Then let them. I won't abandon these kids. Not for regulations. Not for politics. Not for fear of repercussions. A crackle from Daniel's radio interrupted the moment, and James felt a cold knot of apprehension. The captain's voice came through, sharp, incredulous. Harper, what the hell is this? You're supposed to secure the area, not run a charity. Sir, James said, calm but firm, there are 200 children here. Starving. Sick. Some as young as 3. I cannot leave them. Enemy civilians, Sergeant. Not our responsibility. They're children, Captain. Human beings. That makes them everyone's responsibility. A long silence followed, the crackle of the radio filling the room with tension. Then, finally, fine. Hold position. Medical units and supplies are on the way. But this better not blow up in my face. April 1945, Bavaria. The war in Europe was in its final stages, yet danger still lingered around every corner. Sergeant James Harper's unit of American soldiers had been moving cautiously through the rolling countryside, the remnants of Germantown scarred by bombs and artillery fire. The countryside seemed eerily quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. Smoke rising from a distant structure caught the edge of James' vision, and he signaled for the men to halt. Through the binoculars, a massive old barn came into view on what had once been a thriving farmstead. Smoke drifted lazily from crude chimneys made of scrap metal. Harper's instincts flared. Could be enemy holdouts, Private Rodriguez murmured, raising his rifle instinctively. James didn't dismiss the possibility, but he weighed it carefully. Could be soldiers, could be civilians, he replied. His voice was calm, measured, though his heart raced. The war was winding down, but that didn't mean the danger had disappeared. Desperate men did desperate things, and even in the final weeks of fighting, civilians had learned to hide or exploit American troops' mercy. The unit approached the barn slowly, their rifles ready, senses on high alert. The barn was old, ancient, really. Thick timber beams and stone walls had withstood decades of weather and somehow survived bombings that had flattened surrounding villages. As they drew closer, James froze mid-step. From within the structure came a sound that cut through the tense silence like a knife. Children crying. "Hold fire," he barked, lowering his weapon. "Kids?" Rodriguez asked, disbelief in his voice. "German kids. Could be a trap." James hesitated, then motioned forward. "Could be exactly what it sounds like. But we'll find out." Carefully. The heavy wooden doors of the barn groaned as James pushed them open. Inside, the sight was almost too much to bear. The space was packed with children. Their small bodies huddled together for warmth. Ages ranged from toddlers barely able to walk to teenagers, all emaciated, filthy, and terrified. Harper felt his throat tighten. "Dear God," Corporal Miller whispered behind him. An older girl, perhaps 15, stepped forward, speaking rapid German. Private Kleen, the unit's translator, leaned in. "She says they're orphans," Kleen said, voice trembling. "From Munich. Parents killed in bombings or during the fighting. When the orphanage was bombed, the staff fled. The children walked here, 40 miles, searching for shelter." "How long have they been here?" James asked, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. 2 weeks. No food left. 3 children died yesterday from hunger and cold. The contradiction was unbearable. German children, technically enemy civilians, were dying while armed American soldiers stood mere meters away. Rules and military regulations felt meaningless against the immediate reality of suffering before them. James' mind raced, balancing logic, protocol, and what his conscience demanded. "What do we do?" Miller asked, finally breaking the stunned silence. James looked around at the barnful of hollow-eyed children. Their nationality, their supposed enemy status, suddenly didn't matter. "We help them," he said firmly, "sir." "Regulations," Miller began. "I don't care about regulations. These are children. We're soldiers, not monsters. We help them. Command can worry about paperwork later. But these kids? Not on my watch." The decision made, Harper directed his team into action. Rodriguez and Miller scouted the farmstead for supplies. Kleen spoke with the girl, learning what was needed most urgently. Daniels radioed command, reporting that civilians required immediate humanitarian assistance. Within the next hour, the unit discovered a root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables, a clean well, and a shed with firewood. The farmhouse, though abandoned, was intact and could shelter the younger children. For the first time in weeks, the children had hope. Soldiers who had spent years trained for combat were now performing acts of care, feeding, warming, and comforting enemy children. Harper watched them, struck by the strange reversal of war's purpose. "Get them fed first," James ordered. "Small portions. Their stomachs won't handle much after starving." Anna, the older girl, stepped forward. She spoke careful English, learned before the war had destroyed her life. "Why are you helping us? We are German. We are enemy." "Your nationality doesn't matter," James said gently. "Your children. That's all that matters. Command may be angry, but right now, you need warmth, food, and safety. You'll get them." Tears welled in Anna's eyes. "Thank you. We thought we would die here." Over the next several hours, the unit distributed food and water. Slowly, despair on the children's faces gave way to cautious trust. Some smiled, some cried, but all were grateful. Harper and his men worked tirelessly, setting up the barn and farmhouse into makeshift living quarters, establishing a basic routine that could sustain the children. "This is going to cause problems," Clean whispered. "Command won't like this. We're supposed to be liberating towns, not running orphanages." "Then they can court-martial me," James said, surveying the barn. "But I'm not abandoning these kids." Soon, the radio crackled. Captain Morrison's voice sounded tight with irritation. "Sergeant, command wants to know what's going on. This better not be some civilian aid stunt." Harper answered, calm but resolute. "Captain, there are 200 children here. Starving, freezing, dying. I can't leave them. They're enemy civilians, Sergeant. Not our responsibility. They're children, sir. Human beings. That makes them everyone's responsibility." A long pause. Finally, "Damn it, Harper. Fine. Hold position. We'll send a medical unit and supplies. But this had better not blow up in my face." Relief mingled with exhaustion as James hung up the radio. His unit looked at him with new respect. "You just gambled your career for German kids," Rodriguez said quietly. "Worth it," Harper replied simply. As night fell over the Bavarian farm, 200 children slept warm and fed for the first time in weeks. The soldiers had transformed the abandoned buildings into a sanctuary. Medical personnel arrived within days, treating malnutrition, infections, and illnesses. 2 children succumbed to pneumonia and starvation despite their efforts. But the remainder survived because Harper and his men had chosen humanity over orders. The barn, once a symbol of desolation, now pulsed with life. The farmhouse became a hospital for the sickest children, while the older ones helped care for the younger. Anna acted as liaison, translating and organizing, filling in the gaps that war had left in communication and structure. She shared the story of the orphanage in Munich, bombed 3 times, staff abandoned them, children forced to flee alone, and how they ended up at the Harper farm by sheer luck, or perhaps fate. "The director died in the 3rd raid," Anna whispered. "The staff. They just left us. Told us to find family, find shelter. We had nothing." "You did good," James said softly. "You got them here. We're just finishing what you started." The unit worked tirelessly over the following days. Supplies arrived, more soldiers volunteered, and even skeptical commanders began to recognize the enormity of what Harper had undertaken. Colonel Bradford himself arrived to inspect the situation. His presence, austere and commanding, seemed poised to turn the entire operation into a tribunal. Harper led the colonel through the farm. The barn was organized, the farmhouse functioning as a hospital. Children ate breakfast, some smiled, some played, some clung to the soldiers with hesitant trust. Bradford observed quietly, his face unreadable. A little girl approached him shyly, offering a flower. The gesture, simple yet profound, seemed to pierce the rigid officer's demeanor. "You've commandeered military resources," Bradford said eventually, voice cold. "Diverted your unit from combat operations. Violated fraternization policies. I should court-martial you." "Yes, sir," Harper replied. "But these children would be dead without our intervention." Bradford's expression softened. "Then continue. Military humanitarian mission. Full support. Make sure the world knows what real victory looks like." The unit had succeeded. Their gamble on compassion over protocol had not only saved lives but created a blueprint for humanitarian action in the war's dying days. And as night fell once more, the children of the Bavarian barn slept safe and warm, their cries replaced by the quiet hum of survival and hope. The journey across Europe began under the shadow of uncertainty, yet fueled by the fragile hope Harper and his unit had ignited in the children. Trucks rumbled over snow-patched roads, carrying the weary survivors from Bavaria toward the coast.
June 1944, Allied bombers approached the French coast carrying the largest conventional bombs ever built. Each tallboy weighs 12,000 pounds, 5 tons of high explosive designed to penetrate deep underground and destroy anything. The target, German U-boat pens at St. Nazaire. Massive concrete structures protecting the submarines that are strangling Allied supply lines across the Atlantic, the bombers release direct hits. The explosions are visible from 20 miles away. Dust and smoke blanket the entire harbor. When reconnaissance aircraft photograph the damage the next day, they can't believe what they see. The U-boat pens are still standing. Not damaged, standing. The concrete roofs absorbed direct hits from weapons designed to destroy anything and barely cracked. How did German engineers build structures that could survive direct hits from the most powerful conventional weapons in existence? This isn't just a story about concrete. This is about engineering taken to an extreme that seemed impossible. And it worked. To understand why these structures exist, you need to understand what was at stake. In 1942 and 1943, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. Over 3,500 Allied merchant vessels were sent to the bottom. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and Germany was winning. U-boats operated from bases along the French Atlantic coast after Germany conquered France. The submarines would leave port, hunt in the Atlantic shipping lanes, and return to refit, rearm, and prepare for the next patrol. The problem for Germany was that these bases were vulnerable to Allied bombing. A submarine tied up at a dock was an easy target. Bomb the docks, destroy the submarines, and you win the Atlantic campaign. The Germans tried various protection methods. They built anti-aircraft gun emplacements around the bases. They stationed fighter aircraft to intercept bombers. They used smoke generators to obscure the harbors during raids. None of it worked well enough. Allied bombers flying at night could still get through and damage submarines under repair, so German engineers proposed something radical. Instead of protecting the submarines with guns and fighters that might stop some attacks, build structures so strong that bombs simply couldn't penetrate them. Create fortified submarine pens with concrete roofs thick enough to absorb direct hits from the heaviest bombs in the Allied arsenal. The proposal seemed insane from an engineering and logistics standpoint. The amount of concrete required would be enormous. The construction would take massive labor and resources. The structures would be among the largest military constructions ever attempted. But the alternative was losing the Battle of the Atlantic and potentially losing the war. Construction began in 1941. The basic design was brutally simple. Excavate massive rectangular bays large enough to hold U-boats. Build walls of heavily reinforced concrete. Pour a roof slab so thick that bombs couldn't penetrate it. Simple in concept. Insane in execution. The roof thickness at St. Nazaire, one of the largest U-boat pen complexes, was over 23 feet of reinforced concrete. Not 23 inches to 23 feet. That's roughly 7 meters of concrete and steel rebar in multiple layers. Each square meter of roof contained tons of material. The total concrete volume for the entire complex exceeded 480,000 cubic meters, enough to build a solid concrete cube 78 meters on each side, but thickness alone wouldn't work. Concrete under extreme impact tends to crack and spall. The Germans designed a layered structure. The bottom layer of the roof was thick reinforced concrete designed to provide the primary structural support. Above that, a layer of granite aggregate concrete specifically formulated for impact resistance. Then a thick air gap empty space to allow blast pressure to dissipate. Then another layer of reinforced concrete. The roof was essentially a multi-layer shield with built-in shock absorption. The walls were almost as impressive as the roof. Over 12 feet thick at the base, they were designed not just to support the roof but to resist lateral blast forces if a bomb exploded near the structure. The Germans poured the walls in continuous sections to minimize joints and weak points. The concrete mix used special aggregates and high cement content to maximize compressive strength. The internal structure was compartmentalized. Each submarine pen was a separate bay with dividing walls between them. This meant damage to one bay wouldn't affect others. A single bomb penetrating the roof, unlikely but possible, would destroy one submarine at most, not the entire facility. The construction logistics were staggering. Concrete was mixed on-site in massive batches and poured continuously to prevent joints from forming. The steel reinforcement was assembled in prefabricated sections and lifted into place with cranes. Labor came from multiple sources: German construction workers, French contractors, and forced labor from occupied territories. At peak construction, thousands of workers operated in shifts 24 hours a day. The speed was remarkable considering the scale. The Saint-Nazaire complex began construction in February 1941. The first submarine pens were operational by mid-1942, under 18 months from start to first use. By 1943, the complex included 14 submarine pens, each capable of holding a Type 7 U-boat, plus dry docks for major repairs, workshops, stores, and accommodation for crews. The Allies recognized the threat immediately. U-boats operating from protected bases meant they could conduct more patrols, return for faster refits, and maintain higher operational rates. The campaign to destroy the U-boat pens became a strategic priority. Between 1942 and 1944, Allied bombers conducted dozens of major raids specifically targeting these structures. The early raids used conventional bombs, 1,000 and 2,000 pounders. These barely scratched the concrete. Bomb craters would appear in the ground around the pens. The surrounding harbor facilities would be destroyed. The U-boat pens themselves remained functional. Reconnaissance photos showed minor surface damage to the roofs but no penetration. The Allies escalated. They developed the 4,000-pound cookie bomb designed for maximum blast effect. Raids with these weapons destroyed everything above ground near the pens: workshops, cranes, storage facilities, administrative buildings. The U-boat pens stood. The submarines inside remained protected. In 1944, the Allies deployed their ultimate weapon, the Tallboy. Designed by engineer Barnes Wallis, the Tallboy was a 12,000-pound deep penetration bomb. It was dropped from high altitude, around 20,000 feet, to build up tremendous kinetic energy. The bomb would reach supersonic speeds before impact. The design included a hardened steel casing and a streamlined shape to maximize penetration. The physics of the Tallboy were terrifying. At impact, the bomb carried kinetic energy equivalent to hitting the target with a locomotive traveling at high speed. It would penetrate deep into the ground or structure before the delayed fuse detonated the explosive charge. The explosion would occur underground or inside the structure, destroying it from within. Tallboys had successfully destroyed railway viaducts, underground factories, and hardened German bunkers that conventional bombs couldn't touch. The first Tallboy raid on the Saint-Nazaire U-boat pens occurred in June 1944. Multiple direct hits were recorded. The Tallboys penetrated the outer layer of the roof. Some broke through the air gap and reached the second layer. The explosions were massive. Seismographs detected the impacts from miles away. When the smoke cleared and reconnaissance aircraft photographed the results, the Germans were still operating submarines from the complex. The roof had cracked in places. One bay had partial collapse. But the overall structure remained functional. The British tried again. More Tallboy raids throughout 1944. The largest bomb load ever dropped on a single target up to that point. The U-boat pens accumulated damage. Large sections of the roof developed cracks. Some bays were no longer usable. But the Germans continued operating from the undamaged sections. Not a single submarine inside the pens during any raid was destroyed by bombing. They were protected by 23 feet of engineered concrete that did exactly what it was designed to do. Post-war analysis by Allied engineers revealed why the U-boat pens survived what nothing else could. First, the sheer mass. The weight of the concrete roof created enormous inertia. Even a Tallboy impact, carrying tremendous energy, couldn't transfer enough force to the entire structure to cause catastrophic failure. The bomb would penetrate and create local damage. But the surrounding concrete absorbed the blast energy. Second, the layered design. The air gap between concrete layers was genius. When a bomb penetrated the top layer and detonated, the blast pressure expanded into the air gap. This dissipated energy that would otherwise transfer directly to the lower layers. The air gap acted as a shock absorber, something the Allies hadn't anticipated in their bomb designs. The irony is that the U-boat pens became militarily irrelevant not because of bombing but because the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic through other means: better anti-submarine warfare tactics, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, breaking German codes, and improved convoy systems. By late 1943, U-boat losses exceeded their ability to sink Allied shipping. The pens protected submarines that were increasingly ineffective in combat. Here's the remarkable part. Most of these U-boat pens still stand today, 80 years later. The structures were too massive to demolish economically. French authorities tried explosive demolition on some sections after the war. The concrete absorbed the charges and remained largely intact. The cost to completely remove these structures would be astronomical. Today they serve various purposes. Some are museums and tourist attractions. Some house cultural centers and art galleries. Some are used for commercial storage. The Saint-Nazaire complex is partly preserved as a historical site, partly used for marine industry. The massive submarine bays that once protected U-boats now protect boats of a different kind. The engineering that went into these structures influenced post-war military architecture. Hardened aircraft shelters, missile silos, and command bunkers all use principles learned from the U-boat pen designs: layered construction, air gaps for blast dissipation, massive reinforcement, and compartmentalization. The U-boat pens proved that with enough concrete, steel, and engineering knowledge, you can build structures that survive almost anything. The cost was enormous. The labor was exploitative. The purpose was supporting a war of aggression. But the engineering itself was extraordinary. German engineers created structures designed to survive the ultimate weapons of their time, and those structures did exactly that. Not because they were lucky. Not because the Allies didn't try hard enough. But because the math and physics were correct, the materials were adequate, and the construction was executed properly. 80 years later, those structures remain. Monuments not to war, but to what engineering can achieve when pushed to extremes. The U-boat pens that survived 12,000-pound bombs are still standing, outlasting the war, outlasting the weapons designed to destroy them, outlasting the submarines they were built to protect. Sometimes engineering done right lasts forever, even when its original purpose becomes history.
August 1943. A typhoon hits a U.S. military base in the Pacific. Wind speeds reach 150 miles per hour. When it's over, every wooden barracks is destroyed. Roofs torn off. Walls collapsed. 300 soldiers without shelter, 6,000 miles from home. But one type of building stands untouched. Not a single panel damaged. A curved steel structure that looked ridiculous. Engineers said it would fail. It didn't.